What if the most famous story you think you know was never really told by the person who lived it? And what if the truth, his truth, changes everything? Before you read it, before you buy it, find out if it's worth your time and money. Today we're going to be looking at James by Percival Everett. As of the making of this video, this book has been sitting at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for months, and it's not hard to see why. Let me frame this for you in a way that really captures what this book is doing. What if the story you thought you knew was never really his story at all? James takes a familiar American narrative, one that's been told, retold, and taught for generations, and flips it completely on its head. It forces you to step into the mind of someone who was always present in that world, but was never given a voice. And once you hear that voice, once you start to understand what he's been thinking this entire time, it becomes almost impossible to go back to the original version of that story without questioning everything. Now, on top of that, this book has been nominated for over 15 major literary awards, which immediately puts it into a different category of attention and credibility. Just to name a few of the most notable: the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, the National Book Award for Fiction, the Booker Prize, Fiction, the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, and the British Book Award for Fiction Book of the Year. So this isn't just popular, it's critically dominant right now, and there's a reason for that. Here's how this works. I'm going to walk you through the first quarter of the book in detail so you can really understand the setup, the characters, and where the story is headed. Then I'll shift into a broader synopsis of the remaining 3/4 of the story, keeping that part spoiler-free so you can decide if it's something you want to experience for yourself. So the story takes place in the American South during the time of slavery. At its core, this book is about identity, survival, and the hidden intellectual and emotional lives of people who were forced into silence. And the situation the characters are dealing with is essentially this. You have a man, James, who is enslaved, living in a system that denies him not just freedom, but humanity itself. But beneath that surface, there's a reality that the people around him don't fully understand. He's far more aware, far more intelligent, and far more intentional than anyone assumes. And that gap, between how he is perceived and who he actually is where the tension of this story begins. Early on, we're introduced to James, who is an enslaved man navigating a world that forces him to perform a version of himself just to survive. But what makes him compelling isn't just his situation, it's his mind. He's observant, calculated, and constantly thinking several steps ahead. Alongside him, you have a young boy, someone you may recognize from literature, who becomes an important part of his journey. And what's important here is how they connect. There's a dependency between them, but it's uneven. There's a sense of innocence on one side and deep awareness on the other. And there's a growing dynamic where James is not just reacting, but actively shaping outcomes. What makes these characters matter early on is that their relationship becomes the lens through which we see the world, and through which James begins to reclaim control over his own story. So as the story begins, James is already operating in two worlds. There's the version of himself that he presents outwardly, careful, restrained, saying exactly what is expected of him. And then there's his internal world, sharp, analytical, and fully aware of the absurdity and cruelty of the system he's trapped in. And this is important because it immediately establishes that this is not a passive character. He is thinking, adapting, and surviving in very deliberate ways. From there, things start to shift when circumstances force movement, literally. James ends up leaving the controlled environment he's been in, and suddenly, the structure that defined his life is gone. Now, on the surface, that might sound like freedom, but what the author does here is show that freedom, in this context, is unpredictable, dangerous, and filled with new risks. What Everett is doing is repositioning the idea of escape, not as a clean break, but as a transition into a different kind of uncertainty. As we move further in, James forms a more direct connection with the young boy traveling alongside him. And this is where things get really interesting. Because while the boy sees the world in a simple, almost naive way, James sees everything: the danger, the contradictions, the underlying power structures. This introduces a very subtle but powerful tension. On the surface, it may look like the boy is leading, or that events are happening around them. But underneath that, you begin to see that James is actually the one interpreting, guiding, and in many ways controlling how they navigate situations. And at this point, you start to see a larger pattern. James is constantly performing, not just for survival, but as strategy. He adjusts how he speaks, how he behaves, even how intelligent he allows himself to appear, depending on who's watching. And that becomes one of the most compelling elements of the book. As their journey continues, they encounter different environments, different people, and each interaction reinforces the same idea. Perception is everything. James understands that in order to survive, he has to manage how others perceive him at all times. And what the author is building here is a layered narrative where every decision has multiple meanings. On one level, it's about immediate survival. But on another level, it's about reclaiming identity in a world designed to erase it. By the end of this first quarter, you have a clear understanding that this is not just a retelling, it's a redefinition. From this point forward, I'm not going to get into any spoilers, but I will give you a clear sense of where the story goes and what it explores. From here, the story expands into a much broader journey, both physically and psychologically. The conflicts become more centered around control, autonomy, and the constant tension between who James is and who he has to pretend to be. The tone shifts towards something deeper and more introspective. It becomes less about movement and more about meaning. And overall, the book starts exploring ideas like identity versus perception, power, and who truly holds it, the psychological cost of survival. At a deeper level, this story really leans into human elements like isolation, dignity, intelligence, and the quiet resilience required to exist in an unjust system. Without getting into specifics, the trajectory of the story continues to build toward a kind of unraveling, but not in a chaotic way. It's controlled, it's deliberate, and it forces you as the reader to constantly reassess what you thought you understood, not just about the story, but about the characters themselves. What this book does well is give voice to a perspective that has historically been minimized or ignored, and it does it in a way that feels intelligent, intentional, and deeply human. The writing is sharp, the structure is purposeful, and the character of James is one of the most compelling you'll come across in modern fiction. Where it may not work for everyone is the pacing. If you're looking for something fast-paced or action-heavy, this may feel slower than expected. But for me, that pace really worked because it is very intentional. And it's where this book does its most powerful work. Because instead of pulling you forward with constant external action, it pulls you inward, into James's mind. And that experience can be surprisingly intense. You're not just watching events unfold, you're sitting inside the calculations behind them. Every conversation, every interaction, every decision carries a kind of psychological tension because you're aware of what's actually being thought versus what's being said. That creates a constant undercurrent of pressure. As a reader, you start to feel that duality. You begin to notice how exhausting it must be to live that way, to measure every word, to suppress your true thoughts, to anticipate how others will interpret even the smallest action. And over time, that doesn't just stay on the page. It starts to affect how you experience the story. You become more alert, more aware of subtext, more sensitive to what's not being said. There's a kind of quiet anxiety that builds, not because something explosive is happening, but because you understand how much is always at stake beneath the surface. And that's where the immersion comes from. The book doesn't rush you, it traps you in that mental space. You start to feel the weight of constantly having to perform, the tension of knowing that being misunderstood isn't just frustrating, it's dangerous. At certain moments, that psychological pressure turns into something deeper, almost claustrophobic. You're aware that James is always thinking several steps ahead, always adjusting, always controlling how he's perceived. And as a reader, you're doing that with him. So instead of passively observing the story, you're actively processing it alongside him. And that creates a very different kind of engagement. It's not adrenaline-driven, it's cognitive, emotional, and at times even unsettling. Because the more you understand his internal world, the harder it becomes to ignore the reality he's navigating. And that's where the book really pulls you in. Not by overwhelming you with action, but by making you feel what it's like to live inside that level of constant psychological awareness. This is the kind of book that will resonate most with readers who appreciate layered storytelling, strong character work, and narratives that challenge traditional perspectives. If this helped you get a better sense of the book, consider subscribing. I'll be doing more breakdowns like this. Also, a like to this video would be highly appreciated. And if you know anyone who might enjoy this book, please share this video with them.